Hello, boys and girls. It's time for Writer's Workshop. This is Miss Alpine, and today we are going to be talking about narratives and what a narrative writing is. So, narrative writing is a made up story. Sorry, this is fictional narrative writing. And we know that if something is fiction, it means it's not true. So, it's made up. And narrative just means a story. So, it is something that's made up. It has a clear beginning, middle, and end. And every good story has to have some characters, a setting, which includes where or when it takes place, and it has to have a plot. And the plot, I always say, is the dun dun dun. It's the main problem. And here it says also that it has to have a plot that has a solution at the end. So every good story should have some kind of solution. You don't want to leave the reader hanging and you give them a problem and all these things happen, but nothing ever is solved. So we have to make sure that you include that solution at the end. As we progress through the school year, we also want to make sure that we include dialogue. And dialogue are the words that people say in the story. And if you've used dialogue in your writing before, that's great. You can try it out. But I feel like as we go along in the year, we'll actually talk a lot more about dialogue and how we can include that in our writing. And another thing that's really going to help our fictional narrative stories is to use time order words to tell when things happen. And time order words are words like first, next, then. So these are those transition words that tell us when things happen in the story. So when we look at a narrative writing outline, we see again all those things that we need to include. And we want to make sure again we include our characters. The characters you want to set up at the beginning of your story, and this is going to be any of the people or the animals that are important in your story. The setting, as I said earlier, is where it takes place and or when, because sometimes when it takes place is also important because it might be something that happened a long time ago in the past, or maybe it's something that happens in the future. Every good story also has to have a main problem or a plot. And sometimes this plot is really extreme, and sometimes it's just like a little problem. But you always want to think of, well, what's the reason for this story? There has to be some kind of problem that we can fix at the end. And I like to call this the mix-up. So the problem is going to be the mix-up, like something happens. That's going to be a problem for the characters in the story. The events themselves, this is where we're going to find all the details about what happened first, then in the middle, so what happens next. Usually this is where you find that plot or the mix-up. And then what happens at the end of your story. So you want to make sure you include all of those events, beginning, middle, and end, with a lot of good detail between. And finally, at the end of every good story, we have to have that solution. So how did the problem get solved? I call this the fix-up. So here's an expert example of a narrative writing piece. Now remember, this is an expert example. Even this is really good for an adult. So let's pay attention though and see if we can find all those things we have to include in a narrative. This is called The Brown Seeds by Gretchen H. Stephanie and her mother lived on a simple farm outside of a small kingdom. They had very little money, and Stephanie had to work the farm before and after school each day. With little money they had came from the eggs and milk Stephanie sold at the market in town. One day, the king raised the taxes and demanded that Stephanie's mother pay or she would lose her home. Stephanie needed to work extra hard to help her mother earn the money. The next day, while selling eggs and milk at the market, Stephanie met a strange old woman sitting alone. The woman looked sad and hungry. "Little girl," said the woman, "can you spare some milk and an egg for this tired old lady?" Even though Stephanie needed the money to save her home, she carefully picked an egg and a small bottle of milk from her basket and handed them to the woman. The woman's face lit up with a smile, and in return, she handed Stephanie a handful of dry brown seeds. Stephanie told her to plant them and then, or excuse me, she told her to plant them and then to dig under the tree to find a reward. Finally, when Stephanie got home, she planted the woman's seed and watered them. The next morning, Stephanie woke up and walked outside. To her surprise, a beautiful tree stood tall in her yard. She ran to the tree and quickly dug at its base. Underneath the dirt, Stephanie found a wooden box filled with gold and coins. She ran excitedly to her mother, who couldn't believe her eyes. As you can see, Stephanie and her mother were able to pay their taxes and keep their home. From that day on, Stephanie and her mother lived happily ever after. They were able to pay for anything that they needed. This just shows how it is always good to help others when you can. All right, so again, this is a really good narrative with a lot of good details. It has a very clear beginning, middle, end. There's a problem and a solution. So when we take a look at the outline that this writer created, she had the characters, where Stephanie, the mother, and the old woman. She had her setting, which is the farm, the market, and the kingdom. Her problem was that Stephanie and her mother didn't have enough money to pay for their farm. And then the events, she goes to sell her eggs. She gives the eggs and milk to the old lady. The old lady gives her some seeds. Stephanie plants them, and then a tree grows. And then, as we know, the solution was after she dug under the tree, she finds the gold or the box full of gold coins. So that expert model has everything we need in a narrative. Now, for our future writing assignments, we are going to be focusing more on what's called realistic fiction narratives. And realistic just means that it's going to be based off of something that's more real. So when we go to write our fictional narrative stories, we're not going to be including things that wouldn't necessarily really happen. So you're not going to include like aliens or monsters coming or something like that. We need to think what is kind of like realistic that could happen in real life. And so I wanted to watch this short video to tell us more about realistic fictional narratives.
Realistic Fiction Writing for Kids, Episode 1. What is it? Realistic fiction is a genre or type of writing. Realistic means that something seems real. Fiction means stories that are not real. So realistic fiction is a type of writing that seems like it could be real, but it isn't. The things that happen in the story could really happen, though. In realistic fiction stories, the characters seem like they could be real people or animals, but they usually aren't. That means no vampires or superheroes, just regular people. The same is true for the setting. A realistic fiction story wouldn't take place on the moon because that's not realistic. It may take place in a park or at a school. The events that happen in the story are also realistic. The problems that the characters face are real problems that could really happen to real people. So when we write realistic fiction, we use our imagination to create stories that haven't actually happened, but they could. Are you ready to start writing your own realistic fiction story? Check out Episode 2 to learn how to start brainstorming ideas.
All right. So for your assignment today, now that we know what realistic fictional narratives are, you are going to be writing a free write, which means it doesn't have to be perfect. You're just going to write it out and have fun with it. But you're going to write a free write realistic fictional narrative that's based on this picture right here. So take a really good look at this picture. It looks like there's a lot going on, and I'm even kind of like, what? How did this cat even get in here? So it looks pretty silly, but I think we could create a really funny story to go along with this picture. But in your writing, you make sure that you have to include these things right over here. So your story has to include your characters, and you want to set up your characters in the beginning of your story and tell us who are the people and the animals. You want to make sure that you tell us and set up your setting in the beginning of your story as well. So, where is this taking place? Of course, as you go through your events and you talk about your beginning, middle, end, there has to be some kind of problem that occurs. And I kind of see that it looks like they might have a little problem right here. But in the end, we want to make sure that we include a solution. So have fun with this. And remember, include your character, setting, problem, events, and solution as you write this fun fictional narrative story. Let's go be writers.